go live, בוא נראה.
ואז פשוט נזרום משם.
Okay. Kristen, Kristen, are you still there?
Kristen is here to help us, by the way.
Great.
Okay, so it looks like we're live. Kristen, if you could check, please, that would be great. Or Abil, just make sure we're going live. But I think we're good to go. So I'm gonna spotlight you, Abil. Okay?
Yeah, I think we are.
Okay, so let's all the rest of us mute and we can start.
Okay. Hi. Shalom לכולם. Thank you. 1 second. Okay, shalom. For those of you that don't know me yet, my name is Abir Malyanker. I'm Director of Israel Engagement in the Bnei Yeshurun community, Bnei Jeshurun, in the Upper West Side in New York. I'm very happy to be here for another program of Israel Unfiltered. In Israel Unfiltered, we try to bring Israel as it is and try to bring different ideas of different subjects, different speakers to speak about an array of subjects regarding Israel. And I'm typically, especially excited today to speak about the annexation or extension of sovereignty. I know that this is subject that got a lot of attention, and I believe we have a great program today. I think it's going to be very unique. I heard a lot of discussion about it, but not quite of what we're trying to do today. So we're going to explore the annexation or extension of sovereignty in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria through the lens of Jewish values. I'll explain a little bit more about it later. But before we start, and even before I'll introduce the people and the great speakers that we have today to discuss about this subject, I want to give a brief introduction, just that we all know more or less what we are talking about. I will say in the beginning, many things would not be there, and it's fine. It's just to give an idea. I can start in the San Remo conference in 1920. I can start in the partition plan in 47, but I think it would be a good reference point to start in 67, when Israel took control, retrieved, liberated, occupied. You can choose the West Bank. It's part of the 6-day wars, and established a military administration, and established also the first Jewish settlements there, Kfar Etzion, which was constructed or reconstructed. Again, you can choose at the time. After 67, I'll jump all the way to 93 and the Oslo Accords, and I'll say that in all that period, Jewish settlements were built in support of Israel policy and Israel government. And in 1993, the Oslo Accords started. In 1995, the second Oslo Accords basically established an interim self-government for the Palestinians in the West Bank. There are 3 types of territories. There are still three types of territories in the West Bank. Area A, B, and C, you're probably familiar with that. Area A is full control of the Palestinian, while Area C is in full control of still of Israel military and Israel government. From there, I'll jump right to present time, 2020, and basically the subject we're going to talk today. And this is where, for example, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly declared that he would be putting forward this proposal for West Bank annexation. This was in accordance with US government, US President Donald Trump deal of the century or peace plan has essentially given an American green light on extending Israeli law to the settlements and the Jordan Valley, about 30% of the West Bank. And Israel has a physical ability to implement it. That's important. It's not just theory. It can really happen tomorrow. It should have happened in July 1st, but it didn't. But it has the physical ability to happen. The Trump plan maps a future reality in which some 15 Jewish settlements, enclave communities would remain in place under Israeli sovereignty inside a future Palestinian state. That scenario already creates the only considerable security challenges, but complication regarding two different legal structures applying the adjacent areas. And as explained, it's also, we have the opposite problem because as explained by Prime Minister in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, in an interview of the eve of Shavuot. However, such complications are dwarfed by his declared vision for the status of the tens of thousands of Palestinians who live in the Jordan Valley area that he intends, or Israel intends to annex. This Palestinian is specified will not be eligible for Israeli citizenship despite living in Israel sovereign territory. Rather, those areas will remain Palestinian enclaves. In terms of reaction, it would be safe to say that most of the reaction are negative towards that plan or towards the Israeli proposal in regard to that plan. Palestinian threatening in violence, the EU threatening in sanctions, the UN threatening in censor, and the Arab world is threatening to roll back on its cooperation with Jerusalem, even though that like 15, 20 minutes ago, we know about publication about a possible peace agreement, or I don't know exactly what, between the Arab Emirates and Israel in conditioning the complete halt of this annexation. And I think that's it. We can start what we came here for and to, I want to introduce our speakers today, our great speakers. Rabbi, let's start with Rabbi Elchanan Poupko. Rabbi Elchanan is a rabbi, author, and educator. He has written extensively on Middle East related issues and Israel diaspora relations. He grew up in Israel during the years of the First and Second Intifada. Rabbi Poupko is the president of Anton, the American Israel Jewish Network. We also are fortunate enough to have Anton Goodman with us. Anton is an Orthodox Jew struggling for peace, equality, and justice to be core values of the State of Israel. Anton is a director of development at the Abraham Initiative, a Jewish Arab NGO advancing shared society and equality within Israel's citizen population. He's a member of the board of direction of Oz Veshalom, the Orthodox Jewish Peace Movement. He lives in Tzur Hadassah with his wife Anat and their 4 children. We also will hear Dan, a great director, our music director here, that will play us some music chosen by our speakers, which is just wonderful. I can't wait. Dan, Rabbi Elchanan, and Anton, shalom.
Shalom.
I hope you're doing well today, and I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure, an honor, and a delight. Thank you.
And maybe let's start with you, Anton. Tell us a little bit, what's your connection? Obviously, you're Israeli, you live in Israel, but what's your tachlit in dealing with this subject, with annexation, with sovereignty, with the West Bank in general?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's lovely to see you up there. I'm speaking to you now from my home in Tzur Hadassah, which is a beautiful little town in Israel between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And it's up in the hills. And it's also right on the Green Line. It's the Israeli side of the Green Line. So from where I'm sitting now, I can actually look across the valley into Palestinian villages and on the hills above the Jewish settlements of Gush Etzion. And so when you ask what's the connection, well, firstly, I live within this reality. I have very close relations with Palestinians in the towns around me, and I see what their daily life entails. And I work within the field of Jewish-Arab relations, of enhancing the peace discourse in Israel, and talking about issues of peace and justice from a Jewish value perspective. And so really, I'm kind of marinating in this issue, and it's something that's not just a political issue for me. It's very much a religious and a spiritual issue as well.
Wow, thank you. And you, Rabbi Elchanan?
Thank you so much. So I grew up in Israel, and the issue is very, very close to my heart. You can see the flag of Jerusalem is always there, and always, in my heart. And obviously, I am not living there like Anton is, but nonetheless, the issue is close to my heart. And I'm always happy to advocate for Israel and talk about the topic.
Nice. And are there any specific issues that you would say that are closer to your heart in Israel, or just you concentrate, in other words, are you concentrate in political issues, or also sociological issues, or cultural issues in Israel?
It's a good question. So I have a brother that lives inside Judea and Samaria in Yehuda v'Shomron. I know some people consider places like Gush Etzion to be occupied, but he lives in something that's considered an outpost, like the Hilltop Youth type of situation. So I definitely am happy that Jews live anywhere in Judea and Samaria. I have a great relationship with the Yesha Council, Moetzet Yesha, and I just have to say that, before anything political, that in terms of a New York connection, I wrote an article in an Israeli publication when New York got hit very hard, and we were having 700-800 people dying a day from coronavirus. And the first phone call I got from an Israeli, I really did, I was open. I thought, I would get a phone call the next day from, anyone. But the first phone call I got was from Yigal Dilmoni, the head of Yesha Council. And you can look it up. That we got so much support, and I forever remember that. So I think my heart is definitely very much connected to those communities, and thankful for their sympathy and support.
All right, great. So I promised our dear members that contacted me before, and also some other BJ friends, that it won't be a political debate. We are to talk as much as we can at Judaism, and see how our Jewish values, or what we consider Jewish values, are integrated in Israeli policies in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And I want to start by asking Anton, what is a Jewish value for you? What makes a value Jewish?
So I think that's a good place to start, Abner, because I think that Jewish values are really they're a synthesis of the Jewish experience, whether the collective experience or the personal experience, as well as Jewish texts and other kind of guiding principles. When it comes to this issue, I really feel that the Jewish values are very much stacked on the side of the pro-peace camp. That when I look to the texts and to the mitzvot, the commandments that are most often mentioned in the Torah, they are full of the values of human life and dignity, and the values of the other. And so I think we can get into conversations about what we call within Orthodox Judaism pilpul, like the interpretation of texts and how the rabbis have interpreted texts around the years. But I also think that there's a soul to Jewish values that isn't a cerebral conversation about what different Tosfot from the medieval ages said, and that is about something that we carry in our heart, and it's about our experience as a people. And so I would say it's a synthesis of these things coming together. And I know that for me, that's the defining factor also in my attitudes and my political decisions as well.
Interesting perspective. I would like to hear more about what is this soul that you mean, but maybe a little bit later. What about you, Rabbi Elchanan? What's a Jewish value for you? How do you? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I very much agree with Anton that the value of human life and dignity is of supreme import. I mean, anyone in New York knows when you walk right across from the United Nations, they have the words of Isaiah, "Lo yisagoy el goy cherev," and the idea of peace is one that was introduced to the world by the Jewish people, and that's a sacred value. I think, unfortunately, the concept of peace has been misinterpreted. What does peace mean, I think, is a huge issue. How do we define peace? And that's something that I would like to discuss with Anton. So, for example, when I was growing up, it was the climax. There were negotiations, there was a White House party, there was the Oslo Accords, and that was considered sort of the epitome of the Israeli-Palestinian peace. And I was growing up in Jerusalem, and there were buses blowing up, we had rocks thrown at us, I was beaten. And yet today, when I look at Anton and his kids growing up in Jerusalem, his kids have the happiest childhood and have the most peaceful childhood any child in that region has had in 72 years. And so you have to ask yourself, where is peace? Is peace where I grew up, where you had agreements signed with Yasser Arafat on in the Rose Garden in the White House and buses blowing up in Jerusalem? Or is peace like today, where the political process is at a terrible stagnation, like you mentioned, but the fact is that Israeli and Palestinian children are growing up in the most safe and peaceful way. So I think peace and human dignity, human life is the most important thing, and I think we agree on that. But I think we need to ask ourselves, do we want peace to mean diplomatic talks, or do we want peace to mean happy childhoods for the children in Israel and in the region?
Interesting. Thank you so much for that. I kind of wondering, we both agree about the importance of peace and well-being as part of Jewish values. Can you give me another example of Jewish values that are implementing in a positive way, or maybe not enough, and they're not significant enough in Israel, Rabbi Elchanan?
Well, I think Israel is doing an incredible job. Someone said what Israel is doing now is like, and throughout its existence, is like someone doing heart surgery while surfing in the ocean. Israel is just such an incredible manifestation of so many Jewish values in terms of its care for immigrants, in terms of its care for the poor, the needy, in terms of being a home to others. And I think sometimes we in the United States don't appreciate that enough, because when I visit Israel now and I see people from Ethiopia, from South America, from Eastern Europe, wherever it may be, when they have any kind of trouble, they have a homeland that's open to them and cares for them. And that for me is just something so beautiful. And I know that inside Israel, sometimes there's frustration because, as you come closer to something, you see the problems. And of course, there's still poverty and there are still some injustices. But if you look at the large picture, this is the greatest era in the past 2,000 years.
Thank you. Anton, I would dare to say that you feel that Israel is not enough fulfilling or aligned with the core Jewish values that should lead us to peace and well-being. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd really like to, because I don't have any interest in taking this conversation to a place where we're arguing about how good or bad Israeli policy and behavior is, but we are going to fall into it at some point because it's very difficult to sidestep. But I feel that a lot of the successes that Elchanan is somewhat overstating are very few of them are defined by Jewish values or something that is essentially Jewish. And the key issues for me, the moments where Israel can really define herself as an Or Goyim, a light into the nations, of standing out and showing how minorities are treated, how peace is made, and how Jewish values can be implemented into a society that cares for its citizens, I feel that it's sadly lacking. And I do feel that I think it needs to be said that there's a difference between, and I agree the definition of peace as a value here is confusing if we're talking about a level of conflict that we experience. Because I do, and I don't want to discount issues of conflict whatsoever. I mean, I drove to pick my kids up from houses today, and I had to stop in the road because there was a pipe bomb that was being diffused and another one had gone off. And so I think that there are security challenges ongoing, and there's a level of incendiary balloons coming across from Gaza into the northwest Negev now that is untenable. But more than these incidents, the daily life of Palestinians under occupation is a continual human rights abuse that I'm deeply ashamed that the Jewish state is taking a role in. And I think that those who may shrug their shoulders or roll their eyes around it are just not exposed either enough to the reality of that situation, or not sensitized enough to understanding that these are human lives that are involved. And so when I see that the most often mentioned mitzvah in the Torah is V'ahavta et hager, ki gerem haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim, and you must love the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Israel. That is also repeated again in the Torah as Hager hagar etchem, yeh lachem ke'ezrach, that the stranger amongst you, you will treat as a citizen. I don't think that there's any space for interpreting or commentary around those verses. And it talks to not achieving that, but the Jewish struggle to make that happen, to prioritize that issue. And that is the Jewish value for me that is missing.
But priority, I think what to prioritize here is a key issue. And I want to hear you, Rabbi Elchanan. I feel like you already want to react, but let's take a break. I also promised some music here as part of this. So Anton, let's start with you. What song did you choose?
Okay, so I want to say I chose the song Yehi Shalom because about 3 weeks ago, I was involved in running a demonstration against the annexation plan that took place in Jerusalem. It took place in Zion Square, Kikar Zion, which has a lot of memories of demonstrations, some of which that have been insightful and violent. And we wanted to bring Jewish voices of peace, rabbis from different streams of Judaism, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative. There was even a wonderful speaker who lives in a settlement, Hadassah Froman. And there we had some live music and we played Yehi Shalom. And it's really, I feel, becoming the anthem of the religious peace movement in Israel. It talks about what we want to achieve, not what we're against. And we can get sucker punched because the situation is that bad. You can get sucker punched into talking about the occupation the whole time. But instead of that, I wanted to choose this song, a hopeful song, a prayer for peace.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
איזה שיר יפה, what a beautiful song.
And what a beautiful rendition as well, really nice.
Thank you, Dan. תודה רבה רבה. Rabbi Elchanan, I promise you to זכות הדיבור, the right to respond.
Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to follow up. I'm sure you watched Conan O'Brien. Any Conan O'Brien fans here? No. There's a great. He did a great section on, and he goes to Israel. Abir, you know I'm talking about Conan O'Brien. Yeah.
When he visited Israel.
Yes. Yeah. So he goes to Israel. So one of the scenes is he goes to Israel. He goes to the market, and one of the things he does is he starts haggling. He starts, haggling back and forth. It's part of the culture of the Middle East, very much to haggle. You say this much, I say that much. Eventually, we reach a compromise, right?
Yeah.
I think a critical moral mistake that many have done in the discussion about Palestinians' rights is they started haggling for the other side, and what that did is it took out the motivation for the other side to sort of have a conversation with itself and say, wait, what am I willing to compromise? What do I want to get? And sort of having the conversation for them. So you have that in people like Peter Beinart writing a column on what should be done with the Palestinians. And he speaks about a one-state solution. But the Palestinians then say, wait, this is so offensive because no one asked us. No one cares about what our opinion is. And I think often what happened in this conversation, and it's described also in memoirs from when Omer, Sharon, others were in Camp David, is that sort of we bargained, against ourselves or for the other side. And in that sense, we did a disservice for the other side because they lost any kind of ability to say, okay, here's what we'll compromise on, and here's what we won't compromise on. The other thing that I just wanted to say about what Anton said, you spoke about the pipe bombs and the balloons coming out of Gaza, which is obviously critical. And then you said, but more importantly, I want to talk about the inequality. And here I want to speak as a child, not as a grown adult. I was in Washington a year ago with a group of progressive rabbis, and they're all asking, what about the Palestinians? And I'm asking myself, where were these people when buses were being blown up, when people were being beat on the streets of Jerusalem, and when rocks were being thrown? And so today, I think, pipe bombs are an issue. However, more importantly, what about the political process is kind of outrageous because it sort of diminishes the value of human life, the value of security, and the well-being of people. And I gotta say, Palestinian children growing up today are growing up in infinitely calmer, happier, and more peaceful environments than today. So I think, again, it goes back to my same point. How do you define peace? And this is a very Jewish question. Is peace the absence of violence, as the Canadian Constitution says, good government, or is peace, just a political process and the lives of the little people don't matter? And I think that's what this boils down to.
Before I move to Anton, I just want to, when we spoke on the phone, you said yourself that you mentioned here that you are for settling in Judea and Samaria as is part of Israel, but you said you opposed the Trump deal of the century, and you said also like even you cannot defend it. Maybe you can say a word on that.
Yeah, so I think the Trump deal of the century does exactly what I said now. It's sort of a strange way where the far left and the far right met.
Exactly, yeah.
Where we are doing the haggling for them. So the Trump deal of the century makes the decisions for the Israelis and for the Palestinians and says, here's the deal. Well, what did the Palestinians say? And so now I acknowledge there's a Palestinian narrative, 100%. My narrative is not my narrative, and their narrative is their narrative. And I'm willing to say it's 50-50. Maybe they're right, maybe I'm right. Let's talk.
Yeah.
I'm not going to negotiate for them. I'm not going to make decisions for them. So as long as I'm here, I think Jews should settle in all of Judea and Samaria. Now, if a Palestinian leadership, a really national movement would come and say, okay, I see your side and here's what I want to compromise, then I think we can talk. But I think to sort of impose on, an artificial deal that doesn't take into account any, Palestinian side or ask them what compromises they're willing to make is problematic. Moreover, the Trump peace plan, so to speak, besides for not asking the Palestinians for any commitments, also takes parts of Israel. So, the kibbutzim that are on Otef Aza, those areas. So in 1948, those people fought for the existence of Israel. Those people defended us against the Egyptian columns.
The 11 points in the Negev. Yeah.
Exactly. And if you look at the Trump deal, and I'm shocked that people like the ZOA or other organizations that are more consider themselves right-wing or pro-Israel said nothing about it. The Trump peace plan did what not Clinton, not Obama, not Bush. No one even thought of this, of taking parts of 1948 Israel and making it part of a Palestinian state. I mean, the fact that there was no uproar on that is just is kind of historical to me. I don't understand it. And so I think the Trump peace plan, doesn't take the Palestinian side into account or ask them for a narrative. It gives parts of the 1948 Israel, and it also creates a road. It mandates a road between Gaza and the West Bank. Also, I don't know why right-wing organizations didn't cry bloody murder about this, but it mandates a road from Gaza to the West Bank, which, in my opinion, unless Hamas recognizes the state of Israel, is not something we can do.
Anton, I thank you, Elchanan. Anton, I think you would agree on the right of the Palestinian to take an equal part of the process of any peace plans, but maybe for the exchange of territories, you have something else to say.
I do, and I'm going to refocus us on a Jewish value-based conversation, because I don't think that many of the things that have been said, I don't really want to get into a debate around them, and frankly, a lot of them are not worthy debating. But let's go to a Jewish value issue, okay? And let's talk about really the prerogative of Jewish living in the land of Israel. And it's clear throughout the Torah and Jewish texts that the Jewish people has this very close relationship, and we can only fulfill our potential as a people within the land of Israel, or at least that's what happens to the biblical people. And I come from a religious perspective that sees the inherent value of having the Jewish people in the land of Israel. But there's two schools of thought around that. And it's been developed, and I think that it's telling that this conversation is between someone from Moshe Shalom, the religious peace movement, and someone who's representing more the Gush Emunim, or the faithful of the settlement movement, the Yesha Council, because really our two organizations parted ways at a very important juncture of Israeli history, which was following the Six-Day War and the religious interpretation of the Six-Day War victories. And this is something that we're still struggling with in Jewish society in Israel. There have been great successes for Jewish society in terms of Torah learning, and we lost the great Rabbi Din Steinsaltz this week, and remarkable developments in Jewish thought taking place. But at the same time, the Jewish state has caused a number of challenges, and I'd say some leading us towards extreme opinions within religious Zionist community. And the two values that are at odds here, basically, is the first that says the land of Israel is meant for the Jewish people, and the more Jews who can settle in the land of Israel and keep mitzvot and keep the commandments and bring a kind of Jewish life to the land of Israel, the better. And the second school of thought, which is really behind the settler movement, the second school of thought comes to say the land ownership is not the critical key mass here. That is clear from Jewish texts, and I can quote them from left to center. The opening Rashi in the Torah to the Lord saying that if you behave correctly and morally, then the land will be good, and if not, it will spit you out. Our behavior on this land is the critical point. And therefore, for me, the issue of what piece of land we own and we don't own is much secondary to the Jewish values on which that land ownership takes place. And the situation that we find ourselves at the moment, and I haven't spoken about a diplomatic level of engagement, I haven't spoken about the peace process, but what I do want to speak about, because Elchanan brought it up, is the value of human life and of individuals. And for me, to live in a Jewish state where it should be firmly founded on these Jewish values, and yet the level of inequality that I see on a daily basis, for me, that is a quaver. It is a huge halachic mistake. A few weeks ago, we saw an autistic man, Iyad Khalak, who was killed in the entrance to the old city by soldiers who I hope mistook him for someone else. A very unclear event. He was ran into a corner and he multiple machine gun shots and he was killed. The police have just issued a statement saying that they won't be investigating that murder. And the same thing stands for a neighbor of mine. There's a friendly with the large family that lives in the...
Go to the mic because we hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. And the same in my neighborhood where I live next to the town of Wadi Fukin, which is a wonderful agricultural town of Palestinians in the Palestinian territory. There's no conflict between our towns. These are very peaceful and ethical people. And one of the sons of the town, Ahmed Manasseh, in his early 20s, was shot to death on the road to Gush Etzion by an Israeli soldier. And the army issued a statement saying that they are going to maybe put the soldier on trial because they feel that a mistake has been made or something happened. The family has heard nothing about it. The court case hasn't started. And this is, for me, as if we're talking about Jewish sovereignty in the land, I start to question the worth of Jewish sovereignty in a land that treats other people in this way. And unless we reroute and set our course firmly on a path that says there might be political realities that are difficult, but we hold the obligation for the rights of individuals and for the rights of Palestinians who are suffering daily, both within the state of Israel and more so in the occupied territories, then we're not living up to those Jewish values of our behavior on the land and not just land ownership.
So, Elchanan, maybe isn't that possible that we just have, prioritized or organize our Jewish values differently? It seems like we all agree on Jewish values. We just not so much agreeing on the which value is more important or what value is stronger.
So it's a very good question. I think what we need to clarify for our sort of terms of operation is what are we dealing with? Are we dealing with the moral questions or the practical questions, the logistical questions? And with that, there are, I think there's a huge deal of confusion. You have the, hawkish Americans who think that they're commanding a column of Israeli tanks from their living room in the United States. They say, Israel should go in here and should do that. That's one type. And obviously, from not in Israel, I have no logistical say on anything that's happening in Israel. Obviously, that's for the Israeli people to decide, for the experts to decide. That's not my role. Golda Meir famously spoke to an American president, and I forgot which one it was, and she famously told him, "You're the president of 200 million people, and I'm the prime minister of 3 million prime ministers." So everyone thinks they're an expert. So I think we need to make sure that we know what we're talking about. Are we talking about operational questions or are we talking about moral questions? In terms of moral questions, there's no disagreement what we value or what's right. There's no question that human life, dignity, and well-being come before anything. That comes before anything. The question we have is how to go about that and how to move along that. What I think has been lacking from this conversation is that sometimes there's this, are you on this side or are you on that side? And there's a failure to recognize that We need to care for everyone. We need to make sure everyone's doing well, and that does not necessarily go through a political process. I also have to acknowledge something that's unfortunate in this conversation and the global conversation is to recognize that democracies are imperfect. We saw what happens in America. We see the way the African-American community has been treated. We see the injustices that have been taking place through police brutality in the United States, in London. There have been people that were shot in London. And so I think there's this unfortunate phenomenon of sort of zealots in Israel to say, look, Israel did this or Israel did that, when in fact, that's not necessarily something that's an international scandal as much as something you need to improve internally. It's not that Israel is worse off than the United Kingdom, than the United States, than Canada, than Australia. It's, yeah, democracies are imperfect. And as Winston Churchill said, they're the best system that works. And we are always striving to be a more perfect society. And that's absolutely valuable, but you just need to keep that in context. You just need to make sure you don't say, oh, well, Israel is the worst possible.
Thank you so much. We would continue in a few minutes, but before that, Rabbi, want to tell us the story you chose and why?
Yeah, so the song I chose is a very famous song. It's called Ani Noladati LaShalom. It's a very popular Israeli song, and it just speaks to me about the incredible value Israelis put on peace. And also the recognition that it's always a struggle. It's always something we yearn for. We don't always get it in one time. We always strive for it. So it's Ani Noladati LaShalom. I was born to the peace. It may have not come yet, but we're always striving to come closer and closer to it.
Amen.
I just got to say about Dan playing. I think David Broza should get nervous because his music is just incredible. So, kol hakavod, Dan. I love it.
We are fortunate. We are fortunate.
Toda. Thank you.
Rabbi. Thank you, Dan. Again, we will hear Dan again soon. I do intend of giving few minutes because we don't have much more time left, but I do want to speak a little bit. Part of this, the reason we're doing this is to expose people to different aspects of Israel, and because I feel, and it's you mentioned Peter Beinart before, there is a difference between what is seems or perceived to be Jewish value and I'm talking broadly here in the U.S. Among liberal Jews and in Israel. There's a difference, at least in prioritize what is the most significant, and I do want you to give some of your opinions about that, because this is also what we're trying to do here, to bring the two communities together and trying to lekarev levavot, you know, bring hearts together. Anton, you wanna start?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I think that really, for me, signifies the importance of this conversation taking place in an institution like B'nai Jeshurun in New York City. Because this is a Jewish conversation. We've been trying to have a Jewish value-based conversation. We've been trying to bring out the sources and the inspirations for those values, rather than getting into some of the political discourse. And I think that gives us a clue to the relationship that's needed here with the Jewish world community. And I think that the Jewish world community has a role to play in directing the future of Israel. That if in the early years of the state of Israel, really its existence as a miklat, as a refuge for Jewish displaced persons and refugees and communities at threat, really it was the defining factor of Jewish life in order to escape certain places and come to Israel. At the moment, I'm looking to the world Jewish community, whether that's in the US, in the UK, or other major hubs, to join this Jewish conversation about how the state of Israel should act, because it's not the issue that it needs to reflect on each of us, rather than each of us has an obligation to have their voice heard and to push their values into the DNA of the state of Israel. And today, the really interesting thing is I might have organized a demonstration in Jerusalem, and we had a couple of webinars here in Israel, but there's much more interest about that proposed annexation plan in amongst US Jewry, amongst world Jewry, than there is in Israel. And it's definitely not something that's grabbed the Israeli psyche, because it's been done really at a very cynical time, opening the conversation while the citizens of Israel are struggling with the implications of the corona crisis, and recently 1 million Israelis unemployed, and people finding it difficult to close the month here, and then to bring an issue like the annexation to the table that needs public discourse is really very much been quietened around it. And so I think it's interesting that the American Jewish community, at a time when there's a lot of issues that the American Jewish community needs to focus on, has focused on this issue. And I think that the reason behind that is because it comes from an American Jewish value here. It comes from an understanding of what it means to be a discriminated minority, or what it means to be to fight in a civil rights movement, and to continually try to struggle to make society a better place for everyone, even if there are costs to doing that. But it takes it a stage further, because Elchanan and Rabbi Poupko wanted to suggest that we're all imperfect democracies. And within the state of Israel, we are certainly an imperfect democracy. I would say not as imperfect as the American democracy at the moment, but we're certainly imperfect. But we're talking about over the green line into the occupied territories, okay? Where those rights do not exist. The freedom of movement that I have.
I think that Anton froze. Do you seem frozen also, Rabbi Elchanan?
Yes, I also see.
I lost you. Sorry that I dropped.
You're good. He's back. He's back.
I'm sorry that
All right.
And these rights, they don't exist. And so the American Jewish experience, combined with the American Jewish values, is a voice that we desperately need within Israel. It is a legitimate voice because we are having a value-based conversation here. And it's a voice that is
We lost you again, Anton.
definitely needs to be amplified. We've been, sorry. Pass across to Elchanan, I'll sort out my internet issues and be straight back, okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Speaking of Jewish values, first of all, it says that, you know, one of the mitzvahs in the Torah is, it says, Ein danin et adam shelo befanav. The court or Beit Din are not allowed to hear one side without the other. So I'll try to speak, but obviously I want Anton's perspective here. But I do want to share with you that I find the idea of outside involvement in what's happening in Israel, particular in this regard, again, disturbing. And the reason it's so disturbing for me is because, like I told you, when I was in Washington a year ago with a lot of progressive rabbis, and you know, they're all saying, what about the Palestinians? What about the roadblocks? Whatever it is, I was, you know, I gotta say, I had to leave the room. My blood was boiling. And the reason is because I asked myself, where were these people when I was a child in Israel and buses were blowing up? Where were they?
Yeah, but you've said that, Elchanan, I'm sorry to stop you, but you've said that twice. And I've also seen the blood buses blowing up. So I think that it's a bit misjudged, your self-righteousness on this issue. I'm with you. I do not want to see buses blowing up. I've seen it enough times, but I don't want to, I don't think that you can rest on some kind of a terror experience to therefore negate the work for peace for the rest of the generations. The reason I work for peace is I have 4 children downstairs, Elchanan, and I don't want them to serve in the Israeli army. And I don't want them to have to go into the occupied territories and go into people's houses at night and tear their mattresses apart because of what it will do to them. I don't want them to be part of that experience. And so please, I'm not a progressive rabbi sitting in Washington, D.C., even though I have a lot of friends who are, and they're well-versed and understand the issue well. And I'm sorry if it makes your blood boil, but there are people who legitimately hold the opinions that the occupation is neither peaceful nor just.
Right. So again, like I said, it's very important to stick to our definition of what peace is and to not confuse the political value of peace and the issue of well-being. And so, yes, indeed, there are...
What about the Jewish value of peace? You haven't spoken about it.
Okay, so I think that there are... unfortunately, what happened is that in this process of the past 30 years already, unfortunately, much of the political discourse has shown to be sort of a seesaw with this situation on the ground, where unfortunately the reason Israel's left, parties like Meretz and Labor, are now at an all-time low is because unfortunately the Israeli population has learned that often there's an inverse correlation between the security measures and the political process. So yes, you're right. It is terrible that inside the West Bank, there are all those checkpoints and walls and restrictions. But it's unjust to pretend that those came out of nowhere. We need to remember that life was so much worse for Palestinians and Israelis before those came. And so you have to have it in the broader context of saying, wait, why is it like this? Why is it that Israelis were taught that they have to choose between security and a political process? Why can't it be both, right? Why is it that your children may have to go and dig through some Palestinian's house in the West Bank? Is it because of Benjamin Netanyahu, or is it because if you take a poll now in the West Bank, 70% of the population would vote for Hamas today? So I think you need to have that perspective in mind and ask why? Where is this coming from? Who is responsible? And why is it that the Israeli population was shown and votes to see that it's either security or political process?
We really have 2 minutes. I'm really sorry. It's just getting interesting. I think, right now. So, I do want to see if I understood correctly. Are you, in a way, saying you're opposing Jewish involvement, Jewish outside of Israel to get involved in Israel?
I think that Jews outside Israel often only see the political process and unfortunately don't see the cost that process often means. And how many Americans or Jews in the diaspora can tell you the number of Jews who died in the first and second Intifada? How many know that number is greater than the people who died, number of people who died in the Yom Kippur, in the 6-Day War? How many people know that it's around 3,000 people that died in Israel during that, what we call peace process? I don't think many people know. And so not seeing the facts on the ground and sort of coming from an ivory tower and saying, here's how we should solve it, lacks the vision of what those policies mean to the people living there.
Anton, last words before I wrap us up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to understand that when we're speaking about Jewish values and when we're speaking about concepts and ideals, it's about the struggle to live up to them. And sometimes there's the reality that can get in the way and that you can't achieve it. However, at the same time, both myself and Rabbi Elchanan are Orthodox Jews. And if someone was to come to a rabbi and say, you know what, Shabbat is really difficult for me to keep. It's really difficult. The rabbi would say, you know, you got to make an effort. Or you're on a process, you got to make an effort. Orthodox rabbi, that's what he says. It's hard to give tzedakah. It's hard to honor my mother and father. In fact, you can take any Jewish law and value and go through it with an Orthodox rabbi and make the effort until it comes to the value of peace, where the religious community, the Orthodox community in Israel has lost its way and will never say, you have to struggle for peace. We'll never say, oh, instead they will bring political reasonings, anecdotes, slightly massaged statistics about why the Palestinians are like a biblical enemy to us and why there can never be peace. And this is unacceptable within theological Judaism, okay? There is nowhere where it says within theological Judaism, you can cut yourself a hall pass if you have a certain political perspective on things. No, the striving for equality within society, for treating the weakest among us with respect and lifting them up and pursuing justice and peace. And I think that when we add the word justice to peace, we should understand what we're actually talking about, a just peace, pursuing that. These are key tenets. And there is no hall pass that you can cut yourself because of some reading of a political reality. Judaism is aspiring to reaching spiritual goals and bringing God to earth. That cannot happen so long as this people is involved in the occupation, and every religious Jew should be standing up, raising their voice, and promoting a peace and just solution that will lead to less conflict, but most of all, will lead to the Jewish values that we subscribe to. Thanks.
Thank you, Anton. Elchanan, I want to give you also 1 minute to say, concluding some of the things we talked about.
Right. So like you're saying, indeed, we always need to strive for more, and peace is obviously a top value. Like I said in the beginning, peace is something we must strive for first and foremost in the context of life, facts on the ground, and how people are affected. If we find that peace means no political process, and yes, people living in safety, security, and relative well-being for the Middle East, we also need to remember what neighborhood it is. It's not the Upper West Side. It's 200 miles away from Beirut, where we see what happens when you have a society that's too cuddly with terrorist organizations. And so we have to remember the neighborhood and the value of human life, and peace being, like you're saying, like you're living, where there are Palestinian villages. Of course, the conditions are not ideal, but where the well-being of people is our first consideration.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. It was thought-provoking and amazing. I do want to end with our last subject. I think it's a key subject in this conversation of a conversation of Jewish values, a broader Jewish conversation on values. And I don't know, there is a book by Daniel Gorodis. He got mixed reviews from across the board, but he does mention something there that I think is worth repeating here. And he says that Israel is the only subject, yeah, and I'm rephrasing, is the only subject that still is significant to all of the streams of Judaism, and it's still something that is debating across the board. It's not LGBTQ rights, and it's not who is a rabbi, or it's not even who is a Jew. The only thing that bringing the streams together in a discussion, you don't have to agree, is Israel. And I think we should see it, personally, I think we should see it as an opportunity to have a Jewish-based, Jewish value conversation among us. And I want to thank you so much, both of you, of being here and discussing this with us.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing us together. And, you know, it's just an incredible opportunity. And although we're divided by a few thousand miles and Atlantic Ocean, it's great to have the opportunity to speak to Anton, who's, like you were saying, actually living in Israel and forming the future of the country. And it's always important to, like you're saying, Abir, that no matter what happens, we're one people, we're always going to come together. And even if we don't share opinions, we are Am Echad, one nation, united despite differences of opinion and differences of geography.
תודה רבה. We will end with another great treat from Dan, a song called the Blues Knaani, Knaan Blues in English. It's an interesting song, not only because of the name that is like sort of implying of a blues, of ancient blues sang in Israel, but it's also interesting because of the singer and the songwriter Ehud Banai, which is typically writing about Jewish matters, and he's a great storyteller. So, תודה רבה, and see you in the next Israel Unfiltered.
Thank you.
תודה רבה, תודה דן, תודה אנטון, תודה אלחנן, להתראות.
Thank you